Stay naked. I hope that you can take it.
What can be learned from a story, woven out of fragmented moments of joy, pain, and blissful awareness? I wrote my first book, Flesh Mapping, in 2013. It was an invitation into co-creating a pedagogy, a way of learning through our shared narratives of place and politics, a way of mapping the injuries of the material, emotional, spiritual impact of all our many journeys of growth. Some may call it struggle, forced poverty, displacement, hunger, and war. As a child raised in war, I've learned many lessons. And in the art of living, I'm inviting some of my heroes, some of the people who walk with me, who have taught me to walk in beautiful ways, to see co-creation, to see community as our immunity to pain, to suffering, to wanting. Welcome. I'm your host, Sylvia Richardson, and this is The Art of Living. I'm joined by prolific author Peter McLaren. He is the author of over 70 books. His latest is a comic book titled Breaking Free: The Lives and Times of Peter McLaren. Thank you so much for joining us, Peter.
Oh, it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, I'm moved by this book, and I want to start by talking a little bit about how in your book you are depicted as this white working class youngster who becomes radicalized. Tell me about the moment of rebirth when you were awakened to not only the history you had been taught, but also your own power and responsibility to become an actor and co-creating a new history of the world.
Well, that's very beautifully put, and it's a great question. The comic book, actually, I recognize that there are comic books or what we call graphic novels. I mean, they're actually different in many ways. So my new book is actually a combination, I guess, it's a hybrid of a comic and a graphic novel. It basically begins with my upbringing in Toronto and in Winnipeg, and basically being born into a very conservative family that had a kind of military overture to it. My dad fought for the Royal Canadian Engineers in the Second World War. For 6 years, he was overseas fighting the Nazis. And my uncle was actually a war hero. He helped sink the Bismarck battleship and got the Distinguished Service Medal pinned on him by King George VI. He went and joined with the Royal Navy, actually, during the war. And I was very proud of my uncle and very proud of my dad. But it was a very conservative military sort of ambiance that percolated through our lives when I was growing up. The comic book traces my learning about the Vietnam War through professors I had in Canada who had been, teaching in the U.S. They were American citizens, but they decided to resist the war and burn their draft cards and come to Canada. And some of them actually became professors of mine. And they educated me about what was happening south of the border. And so the comic book goes into my trip to San Francisco and Los Angeles and to Berkeley, joining in with the Berkeley protests, etc. And there's a kind of a surreal sense to my life during those times because I met Timothy Leary, who was the high priest of LSD. I met him at the Audubon Ball at the, I guess what you call the Fillmore. And he went through several names. I think it was the Fillmore maybe when I was there. But anyway, I met Leary and got into the drug scene, met poet Allen Ginsberg, who gave me some good pointers in terms of my writing, encouraged me to continue. Then I helped form a little, in a very modest way, a kind of a bit of a pipeline for resistors to come to Canada. I just set out pamphlets who to contact, where you could stay when you came across the border, and people that would be supportive of you. And so then it goes from there to my teaching days as an elementary school teacher in the Jane Finch corridor in Toronto. And a lot of the comic book puts into visual context some of the episodes from my book Life in Schools, and which came out, I think, in Canada in 1979, 1980. And then it goes from my days as a elementary school teacher to a college professor, to a university professor. It covers UCLA in particular, the 2005, 2006 events that targeted me as the most dangerous professor at UCLA. And that was when I was working for the Bolivarian Revolution and Hugo Chavez's government back in those years. And kind of repressive apparatus of the state was really consolidating during those years. And, FBI was in the UCLA library trying to find out what radical students, what kind of books they were withdrawing from the library, et cetera, and they targeted 30 professors at UCLA, and they put me on top of the list. They called us the Dirty 30. So the comic book kind of goes into that, and then it talks a little bit about, my sort of political purview today and the need for a socialist alternative to capitalism. It does feature people that did, in fact, influence me and give me a lot of insights into politics and relationship between, the individual and society and social movements, etc. So I do try to honor about a half a dozen people who did, in fact, help socialize me into a more progressive radical politics, more militant politics, in fact. And so it's going to be a controversial book. It's designed to reach a younger audience, possibly high school students or, undergraduates in university. Yeah, and it also deals with my sort of move into liberation theology as well. My influence, the influence that liberation theology, largely from America Latina, has had on me. So it covers a lot of ground.
When I think about your story, I think about the importance of the singularity of life, and yet how none of us make it alone, right? Like, we all have very unique stories, and there is that essence that of the individual in all of us. However, none of us can ever be independent of each other, independent of nature. We are always interdependent. And I guess what I'm most moved by is your ability to weave both that history, and to bring your students along, to awaken them, right, to what is our responsibility of what we're co-creating. Because we are always in school. We have canons that we are taught, right? There are stories, there are histories of discovery, histories that this was terra nullius, that nothing was here before the conquest began. So how do we find, as educators, how do we guide our students to see the boundaries, the limitations of those stories we have learned, and what is yet to be unlearned? Because so much of it is a need to unlearn, the education of empire and colonial conquest as something that's natural and right.
All revolutionary consciousness, I think, begins with praxis and reflecting on, one's lived experiences And a lot of what happened to me happened just by chance. And for instance, in the comic, I'm on a bus, and I'm a Greyhound bus. I hitchhiked actually about halfway from Toronto to San Francisco, but I took a Greyhound bus part of the way, and I met an African American woman who was reading the autobiography of Malcolm X, and we started up a conversation. And she told me a little bit about the Black Panthers and Black Panther Party in Oakland, and I was really intrigued. And when I was in San Francisco, I made a trip to Oakland, and I met some of the Panthers, for instance. And, meeting the Black Panthers and meeting, activists in various communities, and then having literature presented to me that could help me deepen my understanding of my own experiences. Because as the great educator Miles Horton, who ran the Highlander School in Tennessee, he said, you only learn from experiences that you learn from. And that's, it sounds like a simple statement, but I think it's quite profound. Miles, I had an opportunity to meet Miles Horton, and that was an incredibly powerful experience. Miles, when he ran the Highlander School, was the only place in the United States where Black folks and white folks actually would meet and strategize together. And the Klan, attacked Miles, attacked the organization. The state shut down Highlander School. Rosa Parks was at the Highlander School just weeks before she famously refused to give up her seat and go to the back of the bus. So a lot of it is just, being on a trajectory and making the most of experiences that you have and opportunities that you have to meet people, to talk with people, to engage in dialogue with people. Like in 1985, I was introduced to Paulo Freire at a conference in Chicago. In that meeting, it wasn't exactly a chance meeting. It was a meeting where friends of Paulo set up, an encounter between us. But that proved to be one of the most important meetings of my life. I began a friendship with Paulo Freire, and through these elders, my life was reshaped. You go through a process of self and social formation, and it has to do with taking advantages of moments of possibility that can help deepen your understanding of the world around you, and ways in which you can become an author and a protagonist of your own story. I've just been very fortunate that I've been able to meet people that have inspired me and that continue to inspire me. People like Noam Chomsky, for instance, when I was going through the Dirty 30, attack back in 2004, 2005, one of the people that stepped up to defend me was Chomsky, and I had never actually met him. And I just thought, this is remarkable that, somebody as brilliant and as influential as Chomsky would go to bat for somebody that he had never met. It's just been a life of being inspired by others and opening myself up to that inspiration, not trying to claim that inspiration as simply being self-generated. It's generated in contact I have with other people. But you're absolutely right. I mean, it's the sense that we do things together in connection with others. Erich Fromm, a famous member of the Frankfurt School, wrote that love is not something that we fall into, right? But it's a kind of praxis. It's an activity that we engage in for the purpose of resolving the anxiety that I think all of us face through our awareness of our separateness, especially in capitalist society. Our separateness, how capitalist society creates this sense of false unity among people. And love is a way we try to actually unite with another. And love in this sense, I think, is a kind of source of power. It's a desire to give freely simply because we can and choose to. And so, in other words, love in capitalist society seems to be more based on a contract, a kind of a source of obligation or kind of false giving. And so, radical love, what Lilia Monzo and I call red love, involves an intimate knowledge of others, a celebration of them in their difference from us. Meeting indigenous groups, for instance, and indigenous leaders in Mexico, in Purepecha, the Tarahumara, or the Raramuri, for instance, meeting them, visiting their communities. There's just no substitute for that. And not everyone gets an opportunity to travel extensively. You know, I'm very grateful that I've been able to do that. And I've been able to, you know, have the opportunity to go and make contact with community leaders and people that have been so inspirational. For instance, just last year, I met Dolores Huerta. And that was incredible. And it's, you know, it's been a long time coming. And so you meet someone in person, they're welcoming, they're open. That inspires you to read more about their life history. And by reading about their life histories, it gives you more insight into how you can deepen your own praxis, how you can deepen your own politics. And it helps you to resort your priorities because, you know, the educational system today, especially with the corporatization of education, the businessification of education, we get stupidified sometimes, the stupidification. I get ground down sometimes. You need to get a kind of an injection of inspiration now and again to keep your priorities straight. That's very important for us. And just everyday politics can just be so stressful.
The question for me, though, is we as a people have power if we recognize that we are not alone. But when we sit alone in our little rooms watching the television, we accept that that's the way history is, right? That's the way it's done. That we have a superpower with a military might that can destroy the world many times over. And so everybody must just do whatever this government declares. But as an instructor, as an educator, I think we have a higher responsibility. How do we invite our students in to activate that sense of autonomy, that sense of, co-creative power that allow us to not only envision a society where this cannot happen, but also a society where democracy is a reality?
This is a key question because, I mean, even in the case of Venezuela, for instance, the Bolivarian Revolution, the sense of self-organization, the sense of political activism can no longer rely on the state as it once did, as much as it did when Chavez was in power, for instance. But I think the lesson that we can learn is that abstract political discourse, right, that's grounded really in global proposals, if it's aimed at the society or political situation, if they don't go hand in hand with solving the immediate problems of people, then there's no room for them. I mean, there's no room for this abstract political discourse, and this is what we're seeing. If you're going to have global proposals, they've got in some way to go hand in hand with solving the immediate problems of people in their communities. The question is, grassroots organizations that have an understanding of the larger global trajectory, but they gain their credibility around resolving concrete problems through self-organization, accompanied by democratic teaching processes. And so this is how popular organizations can achieve a capacity that enhances their own autonomy. And that's so important because you're right, people just sort of follow what they read. They're so exhausted, I think, by everyday life under capitalism. They just seem not to have the energy or the will right now to sort of develop community alliances. But I've been emboldened and I've been encouraged by what I've seen, for instance, here in Orange County, for instance, with parent groups like Padres Unidos, just parents that have come together and decided that they were going to, read Paulo Freire, and they were going to learn a little bit about, the new Jim Crow, the school-to-prison pipeline. They have study groups. They go into, juvenile hall. They work with the mothers of children that are in juvenile hall. Groups like Padres Unidos. There's been fights around sanctuary cities for undocumented, mostly Mexicanos, but not solely Mexicanos. And there's a creation of sanctuary cities. So there are popular movements that are gaining strength. I'm encouraged. Again, as I always say, I'm not optimistic, but I'm hopeful. And the difference between optimism and hope, of course, as Cornel West had said once, is hope always needs to be conjugated with struggle, right? If hope isn't conjugated with struggle, then it's simply a form of sort of false optimism. The popular leftist sectors in many countries, for instance, in Latin America, don't constitute a nationwide political force, but they can work at least at the level of being a moral authority. And I think that that in itself is something really important. As they're working to gain greater nationwide political visibility, they can serve as an amazing moral authority. This moral authority can serve as a regeneration that could relaunch, for instance, debates around socialism. We're seeing discussions of socialism a little bit more in the U.S. these days with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, for instance. But the problem with this discussion of socialism is that when politicians are talking about socialism, and those who might be in favor of socialism have to tone down their ideas to a kind of social democracy, for instance, redistribution of wealth, that kind of discourse. And that's not real socialism. So you're sort of starting from behind the line, unfortunately.
How do you define socialism for your students from a Marxist humanist perspective?
Well, that's very interesting. And I think it's a very important question that we need to look at. We have to create a social universe outside of the value form of labor. In other words, by value, I mean monetized labor. We need to transcend basically wage labor. And we have to move beyond that. And a good way to start, of course, is with, redistribution of capital to labor. What we're seeing now is a movement of capital, right, from labor, right, to the wealthy class, to the monetary classes. And so that's a good first step. But it's basically a way of moving towards a non-wage labor universe based on profits, based on the accumulation or augmentation of value. It's a way of creating a social universe where people no longer have to sell their labor power for a wage. And labor power is interesting. That was one of the insights by Marx. He distinguished between labor and labor power. Labor power is our capacity to labor. So when we work, we're basically not just selling our labor, but we're selling basically our entire lives. So we're going to show up at a certain place at a certain time, come hell or high water, and engage in this morally reprehensible social form, which is wage labor. There was a time, Sylvia, where working for a wage and the minimum wage and the notion of wages being determined abstractly by the marketplace, that was considered a great evil. And over time, we've just accepted wage labor as a kind of truism, as something that can't be changed, and it just seems to make sense that, you do this labor for me, and I'll give you this amount of money. The issue of poverty and survival, tax policy, minimum wage, funding of public schools, funding of universities, banking laws, labor laws, public health care, disability benefits, you name it. All of this is an infrastructure that facilitates, more than it helps, in many instances, the perpetuation of poverty. People very often don't understand why people in poor communities, in barrios all across, for instance, the United States, why poverty seems to perpetuate itself. They don't understand that from a kind of sociological perspective. They don't understand the importance of having a social safety net. And what happens with neoliberal economic policies that constantly undercut the social safety net, constantly create cycles of disenfranchisement. It's noteworthy, I think, to understand the pressures that are put on people in marginalized, working class, immigrant communities in the United States, and the social forces that impact them and the lives of people on a daily basis, and how difficult it is to take action. I remember years and years ago in Argentina, for instance, when during a monetary crisis, and the people in the working class communities would go out with pots and pans, and protests, and there would be blockades of highways. And actually, the middle class was affected too. And the middle class would go to the banks and they try to withdraw money, and there'd be no money in the bank account. And so they made alliances with the working class, and that lasted for a few months until the money started to reappear in their bank accounts again, and then they just said goodbye to their working class comrades and went on living, their middle class lives. And those alliances didn't remain. They were just immediately severed once the middle class, groups got the money back in their bank account. So.
We've come to the end of our show, Peter, and I just want to thank you so much for being with us today. I think that the questions you raised are very important and integral to transform not just education, but a society as a whole.
Right. I think that's really the point. Absolutely the point. We need to ask those questions, and we need to ask them now, because I think time's running out.
Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Take care. Thank you for listening to The Art of Living. I'm an educational consultant, an artist, authored. For more information about upcoming events, workshops, retreats, please reach out to sylviarichardson.com. Until next time, remember to be playful, to celebrate joy, and to allow love in all your co-creations.
You'll never have to wonder where the groove went. The groove is you.